So I will now be reading in the Book of Ruth. I know I started the Judges. We're going to go to Ruth because Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. But when exactly in the time of the Judges does it take place? That is what I would like to explore a little bit and give a little bit of historical context to the story of Ruth that we don't get in the narrative itself. So first let us look at the ancestry of Boaz, because Boaz is the man who marries Ruth. So what is his ancestry? Well, Boaz is the son of Salmon. Salmon is the son of Nahshon. Nahshon is the son of Amminadab. Amminadab is the son of Ram, who is the son of Hezron, who is the son of Pharez, who was the son of Judah. So this is his direct descent from Judah. Well, this also means that he is in the direct line of the patriarch of Judah, or the princes of Judah. Boaz would have been one of the leading men of the tribe of Judah. Keep that in mind. But how does this line us up to the story of the Exodus? How soon after the Exodus was Boaz? Well, of course, Judah is when they came into Egypt. And so we have Judah, Pharez, Hezron, Ram. These are the same generations that we read of Moses. We have Levi, Kohath, Amram, Moses. So Ram and Moses are of the same generation. Amminadab would then be the next generation, probably the generation of Joshua. Nahshon, however, we read in the first chapter of Numbers, when they take the first census of the children of Israel, we read that the prince of Judah, who was to number the tribe of Judah, was Nahshon, the son of Amminadab. Which means that he was already a prominent figure. He was one of the princes of Judah. He was one of the heads, probably the head of Judah. Maybe Amminadab was probably the head of Judah at the time, but Nahshon would have been the next. He's the next in line, and a younger man, more able to handle the workload. So Nahshon is chosen to be the one to number the tribe of Judah. But this means he would have been older than 20 when they left Egypt. He would have been more than 20 years old at the Exodus, which means he died in the wilderness. Because all those who were 20 years and older when they came out of Egypt died in the wilderness, except Caleb and Joshua. So Nahshon, he was there at the Exodus, he died in the wilderness. His son Salmon, who is the father of Boaz, on the other hand, we know that he was likely alive at the Exodus, but was definitely less than 20 years old because he married Rechab, the harlot of Jericho. How do we know this? We know this because in the New Testament, Matthew and Luke, I think it's Matthew, tells us that in the genealogy of Christ, he mentions 4 women: Sarah, Rechab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Why would he mention Rechab? Salmon, the son of Salmon was Boaz through Rechab. Why would he mention this if he was not referring to Rechab of Jericho? He is mentioning the most prominent women in the history of Israel, in the history of the Davidic line. If it's not the same woman, why would he mention her? So Salmon is young enough at the Exodus that he does not die in the wilderness, but he is old enough when they enter Canaan to marry Rechab, who was probably in her late 20s, early 30s at the time of the Israelite conquest of Jericho. So we know he was alive, and we know that Boaz was born of Rechab, which means he was born after the conquering of Jericho. So Boaz did not travel the wilderness. Boaz was born in Canaan. But he was born early on in Canaan. Remember Joshua, before the time of the Judges, we have Joshua leading Israel for about 30 years. And it is sometime in this 30 years that most likely Boaz is born. Now, after Joshua dies, we first have the judgeship of Othniel, which we read about in Judges chapter 3, as well as following Othniel, we had the judgeship of Ehud. At what point does the book of Ruth take place? Now, we get a few minor hints here, but nothing specific. So the main thing is that Boaz describes himself as being an elderly man. He's an older man. And this would indicate he's probably at least in his 50s, maybe in his 60s. Back then, men in their 60s still were having children at times. It wasn't uncommon. I mean, it wasn't rare. It was uncommon, but not rare. So, say, if we put Boaz's birth, say 20 years after they come to Jericho, say it took him that long. I doubt it. But say 20 years after, we still have 10 years of Joshua, 40 years of Othniel. You might get him in the beginning of Ehud's. You might get the story of Ruth in the beginning of Ehud's judgeship. More likely, though, Boaz was born early on. It might have been after the 6 years of conquest and things start settling down. Then Salmon marries Rechab and bears Boaz. So say 10 years after they enter Canaan. We got 20 years with Joshua. 40 years of Othniel would make him 60. Unlikely that he'd be in the time of Ehud. The time period of Ruth is probably in the last half of Othniel's judgeship. And so, having read the first 3 chapters of Judges, we now turn to Ruth, because this would be the time period that Ruth takes place, somewhere in here. Now, I do think it most likely takes place before the Moabite oppression that happens at the beginning of Ehud's judgeship. So, it's somewhere in there. I do think it's near the end of Othniel's judgeship, but would be, if it is in Ehud's, it's at the very beginning of Ehud's. But a couple other things we have to keep in mind here because of this timing. We have to remember, Israel conquered Canaan maybe a few years before Boaz was born. He probably does not remember the conquest even. He doesn't remember the wilderness at all. Definitely was born after they come out of the wilderness. But he probably doesn't remember the conquest. But his life has been devoted to building up Israel. They are a new nation. They are not even a united nation. They are divided by tribe. And as a prince of Judah, which is one of the more powerful tribes, he would see it as his duty, which it would have been as a prince of Judah. He would have been working to build up the strength and unity of Israel. We must also remember that it was just before the time of just before those 30 years, so just before he was born, 10, 15 years before, well, not even 10, 15 years, but maybe 10 years before he was born, that we have the episode of Balaam hiring, the Moabites hiring Balaam to curse Israel, and then just persuading them to join in their idolatry. And we have this whole curse on Israel. I think it was like 14,000 people are killed in the plague. The Moabites were not friendly to Israel. Now, Boaz doesn't remember any of this. This happened in the wilderness. But it didn't happen that long ago, as history is measured. There are still people alive, like Boaz's father, who remembers it. The memory of that is still there, and Moab is still an antagonist to Israel. They are still on unfriendly terms. So there is this animosity between the Moabites and their Israelites. And when Ruth, a Moabitess, moves into Israel, she even mentions, which we will go over a little bit in our readings, that there is an animosity, that people don't treat her as an Israelite. They treat her as a stranger, as a foreigner. there's an animosity towards her that she experiences. And there wasn't always this animosity between Moab and Israel. Almost constantly. I think it was King David kind of subjected the Moabites completely under his rule. But even then, there were rebellions later on. The Moabites, most of the nations around Israel did not get along with Israel in general. I think so. There were a couple that actually did, but very few. And we'll deal with that when we get into those later histories. But you got to keep in mind this atmosphere. The Israelites are new to the land. They have just conquered it. They are weak. They're not weak. They're actually very strong, but they are divided. And they are trying to build up a new nation. Even the land that Boaz is working, it's new to the Israelites at least. They're still building up the cities. They're still building up the towns. They're building up their strength. And the surrounding peoples don't like it because they realize, this is something that I think the Moabites knew that if the Israelites ever did become united, they feared the power of the Israelites, and they knew that God was with Israel. Because remember, the Moabites are descended from Lot, Abraham's nephew. Now, it's been 430 years since the time that Abraham received the covenant, which is about the same time that Lot and Abraham separated. But Lot was a righteous man. He followed the gospel, and he taught his sons the gospel. And they were righteous men. We have no reason to believe that Moab and Ammon themselves, the two sons of Lot, were not righteous men. So they know God. Now they worship false gods now. They've turned to idolatry. But they know God, which is why they hired Balaam, who was a prophet of the true God, to curse Israel, because they knew who God was. They just didn't believe he was the only God. They believed they had their God, and that was the Israelites' God, which is why they hired Balaam to curse Israel, because they thought Israel's God would do a better job cursing Israel. So but they understood who God was, and they feared him. And they feared Israel becoming united and becoming too strong for them, which is why there's this animosity here. And you have the same thing with Edom, same thing with Ammon, and the same thing with the Midianites. They're all kind of on the south east of Israel. All of them are descended from Abraham or Lot. They all have at least some knowledge of God, and they fear the power of the Israelites. So when we read Ruth, keep this dynamic in mind. Boaz is trying to build up Israel. Moab is one of their primary antagonists. I wouldn't say they're necessarily enemies all the time, but there are almost constant hostilities. And Ruth, a Moabitess, comes into Israel. And we see this whole dynamic playing out, and we understand, I think we can understand Boaz and Ruth a little bit better when we understand this dynamic of what's going on. But I've rambled enough, so I will see you in the Book of Ruth.